Welcome to episode 7 of the SCORE podcast. I'm your host, Dave Walker, founder and lead tutor at Walker Prep, which has been helping students achieve exceptional score gains on the ACT and SAT since 2014. To learn about the impressive results we've helped our students achieve and how we can help you, visit us at walkertestprep.com. That's walkertestprep.com. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with a very special guest, Mike Bergin. Mike is the founder of Chariot Learning, which provides expert, individualized SAT and ACT instruction and helps students build skills for college and career success. Mike is also a founding president of the National Test Prep Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting excellence and integrity in the test prep industry. He also co-hosts the highly regarded college admissions podcast, Tests and the Rest, and is the founder of TestBright, an educational resource platform and curriculum system currently implemented in 13 states. Mike's dedication to education has made him a respected figure in multiple fields. I'm excited to have him here today to share his insights and experiences. Mike, welcome to the show.
Dave, thank you for having me on the show.
Okay, so today we are talking about the meta of test prep. And I'm sure many listeners are wondering exactly what we mean by that. Mike, on your fantastic website, rootstowords.com, you note that the word metacognition adds the prefix meta, meaning higher, to the word cognition, meaning the state of thinking, leading us to a definition of metacognition as higher order awareness or analysis of one's own thinking or learning processes. This concept of stepping back to observe and analyze our own thought processes is fascinating. Mike, before we dive into the specifics of the meta of test prep, could you elaborate a bit on what we mean by the meta in a general sense and why it's an important idea to understand?
Absolutely. And as the chief vocabulist of Roots to Words, I am impressed by your introduction of the concept by speaking to the prefix meta, which, as you said, means higher or beyond, above. When we talk about a meta game, it is the game above the game. And interestingly, the idea of talking about the meta came from me listening to your last podcast, episode number 6 with Rob Shomes, and one of you referenced the meta in passing, and I was like, the meta of test prep. The meta of anything is really fascinating, right? Because we talk about the game above the game. We talk about the conventions of the genre or the strategies that are employed for success within it. So if you think about any kind of game, any kind of activity, a bounded activity with rules, constraints, and measurable success, there will be a meta. There is a meta in football. There is a meta in martial arts. There is a meta in, any kind of competitive, like there's a meta in chess. There's a meta in everything. And players, let's say this. New players play the game. Experts play the meta. And it's worth understanding that from the perspective of test prep, where there is a meta. Sometimes the meta changes, sometimes it's stable. And a lot of people outside of education have no idea that there is a meta or that they can access it.
Yeah, I love that. New players play the game. And I think you said experts play the meta. That is a very useful way of looking at this. So, okay, you introduce this idea of, how the meta could apply in standardized testing. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. How does the meta apply specifically, now that we have an idea of what it means, specifically to the context of, say, the SAT and the ACT?
So every standardized test is a closed world. If we're talking like from metagaming is often referred, we talk about it in video games. Not a lot of people know I'm an avid gamer, so I love talking about the meta and how it changes for specific games. And the SAT is a closed world. There's specific content that is tested, and there's lots that are not tested, right? There are question types that you will encounter and things that you will not encounter. Every restriction creates an opportunity to bring deeper insight into the process. So in standardized tests, the meta describes what is tested and in what ways those skills are tested. And a really obvious example that, Dave, I know that you find a lot of families you speak to haven't understood this distinction yet, is the difference in the meta between how math is tested in school and how math is tested on an exam like the SAT. The way, the like algebra 2 is the same in both settings, and yet mastering the meta for how it's tested by your teacher in school doesn't automatically translate to success in the same topic on the SAT. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, absolutely. Right. I like to, the way I'd like to describe this sometimes is, and this is probably not the only issue you're referring to, but one of the issues related to this is that the presentation is idiosyncratic. So the way that the material is presented to you, it might be still the same underlying material, and this is true for reading and writing as well, which is my specialty. Uh, but the way it's presented to you, the way the questions are designed is idiosyncratic, may seem foreign to you when you first see it, may seem like something that you are not familiar with. And so part of the meta of test prep is learning how to understand the underlying structure of what you're seeing on the surface.
That's right. There's kind of just what are the rules? How am I tested? A lot of times, families are surprised that their students with really high grades don't automatically earn really high test scores. Well, the
Yep.
meta is different. If the meta is learning how to manage your teachers and their grading systems so that you maximize your grades in that setting, and then you come over to an entirely different way of being graded and scored, eh, one skill set does not suit the other. So it's not that math or reading or writing on tests like the SAT or ACT is inherently harder. It's not. It's the same material that you learned, but the way that you're being tested changes. And in a sense, the ways these skills are manifested are tested. A huge difference would be writing. We meet lots of students that consider themselves fantastic writers, whose teachers consider themselves fantastic writers, who still don't have the foggiest idea of how to use a comma, right?
Exactly.
The meta for the SAT and ACT is understanding objective punctuation rules. You can go very far in other settings without that, but the SAT and ACT say no, for this piece, you need to know these rules.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have an editor. In real life, right? If we're creative and we have a poetic mind,
Yeah.
perhaps we can get away with not understanding comma rules and still be successful writers
Sure,
because there
spell
are
check and grammar check can give us some clues, right? That tell us what to do.
exactly not on the SAT, not on the ACT. Yeah, that's a really good point. As I'd like to point out, and the situation that you referred to where people who do really well in school are come to the tutor perplexed, right? Why am I doing so well in school? And it doesn't seem like my SAT score reflects that. It doesn't seem like my daughter's ACT score reflects her performance in school, right? Because they, as you point out, Mike, because although they're testing the same basic skills, they are very different in many ways, including the way that they present issues and some of the issues that they choose to focus on more so than others, right? Some of the issues that are accentuated on the test that may not be accentuated so much in the classroom. And so, yeah, you have to change. I know it's a bit of a cliche to use the word paradigm, but I'm going to do it anyway. You have to shift your paradigm and you have to
It's a
have some.
great word to use here because that's what we're talking about. If you're a fantastic tennis player and you want to bring your skills over to badminton, well, it's a different paradigm. Like the meta shifts a little bit. It's easier to transport those skills from tennis to badminton than, say, tennis to football. But nonetheless, there's a change. And the better you understand the specific constraints and rule set and measurements of success for your paradigm, the more likely it is that you'll align your efforts with what produces success.
Absolutely. And this is one of the major roles, I think you'll agree, of the test prep tutor. So,
Agree completely because the thing is that when you first start playing anything, if you're playing the game, right? You sit down, you play checkers with a grandparent, right? You're just starting out, you're a kid, you're just playing the game. Takes a long time to learn the meta of checkers. Not that it's that sophisticated, but your grandparent ostensibly knows better. When we enter into new fields, we are, as the kids like to call them, noobs, right? Like we don't know what we're
yeah,
doing. We're just playing it. And if you're committed, you can eventually learn to master your scenario. The thing is that test prep occurs on such short cycles
mhm,
that it is incredibly inefficient to just try to determine the meta yourself. You're just going to sit there and you're going to blast practice tests or you're going to read books, you're going to become a student of it until you crack the meta. And that is highly inefficient. There's no reason for it when there are experts like us who are able to say, look, this is why players have coaches. This is why musicians and performers have directors because you want somebody to come in and help harness your individual work and align you in the right direction. There is a meta for test prep. And even if you wanted to self prep, even if you decided, I want to do this myself, I don't want to work with anybody else, you're still going to, if you're smart, look at what the experts are doing. Look at what the people who are getting the kind of scores you want actually do. Here's a really good example, Dave. And I bet that this happens to you all the time. You sit down with a student, you say, do you read? Like, do you read outside of school? And they're like, who does that? Nobody does that. I said, I often say this. I say, I want you to visualize the student in your class who you think is going to have the highest test score. And they did. Okay, I got the person in mind. Do you think that person reads outside the school? And they're all like, oh yeah, definitely. Like that is part of getting a great test score is having really sound reading skills. The
yeah,
kind of reading skills you can only develop over time, reading uh, age appropriate texts, challenging yourself in certain areas, but reading for pleasure, getting the classic 15 minutes a day in so that you just become a faster, more fluent reader.
yep. Building those schemas so you
Yeah,
have that to draw on when it,
massive.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
So that's part of the meta, right? Part of the meta is having great reading skills. Bringing and doing like becoming a reader. If you want to be great, I mean, and this is a message for anybody. If you have a student who is in lower grades right now, you have a middle school student, you're like, well, what can my young child, my preteen or my young teen start doing now to do better on the tests? Well, lean into this idea that these are tests of reading. You can start learning to read. You can start focusing on math conceptual understanding and competitive math, meaning math problem solving. That's the meta. This is not, the meta in school for math mastery is often that of regurgitation. The ability in very discrete challenges to show that you know a specific rule that you knew you were going to be asked about. Today, we're covering systems of equations. So you're going to get a bunch of problems in systems of equations, and you're going to show that you understand the concept that the teacher wants you to understand the way the teacher told you you'd be measured. The SAT and ACT also test systems of equations, but in a more open, holistic challenge. They may not tell you you need to use a system of equations. They're not going to tell you what aspects to implement. They're going to tell you how to do the work. The meta's different, but if you focus on math conceptual understanding and problem solving skills, you will be better prepared for this test.
Indeed. And it is so important to start that process early because if you're 4 weeks away from the exam, right, probably outside reading isn't going to do much for your score in the span of 4 weeks.
That's another aspect of the meta game of testing, in that you cannot cram a complex challenge of skills that you've developed over a long period of time. You cannot cram for the Olympic trials. You cannot cram for a test that is really evaluating skills that you developed over an entire academic career. Whereas you can for certain other tests, right? AP US history, go ahead, study right up to the last minute because you're cramming a lot of knowledge in that you probably don't need to remember later. This is not the same. It's another test with a different metagame.
Indeed. I try to stress the idea of analysis, right? On reading, especially, right? SAT reading, ACT reading. It's not merely a test of reading comprehension. Sure, you need to have good reading comprehension ability, but largely what you're being tested on is your analytical skill. And, the longer you spend reading outside material, like you said, age appropriate, so it's not overwhelming for you, the more you have done that over the years leading up to exam time, the better base foundation of analytical skills you're going to have. Even if you don't really realize you have those, they will be there for you to draw upon.
You know, it's something funny about meta. Even though meta means something, as you know, it's an old root of classic language, but it's also considered an acronym for most effective tactics available,
Mm.
right? META. And one, like the most effective tactic for test prep is something that a lot of test takers surprisingly blow right by, and that's taking practice tests. Okay. Part of the meta of preparation for taking standardized tests is to take standardized tests, to take those tests under timed conditions, under simulated test conditions, using official material, reviewing what you do. It's fundamental. And again, if you look to see what the students earning the highest scores do, they all take lots of practice tests.
Yeah.
If you want to leverage that, just do what the experts do.
Yes. And when you do take those practice tests, review your performance afterward and analyze your performance to the best of your ability. Now, like you pointed out earlier, Mike, you don't want to try to reinvent the wheel. That's what the tutor is for, to help guide you through that process of analyzing your performance on the practice test. But the tutor can't do the work for you. This is something Rob and I discussed last week as well. The tutor can't do the work for you. So as best as you can, dedicate yourself to analyzing that performance between each practice test. Well, Mike, let me ask you one final question here. Does the meta in testing or test prep ever change?
It's a good question. Depending on the game, the meta changes, right? In video games, sometimes the meta changes because the developers want to make the game fresh. So they lower the efficacy of certain skills, they improve the efficacy of others. In other settings, like in football, the meta changes based on how offensive and defensive coaches react. And, so your meta changes in response to your opponents. The tests are stable for as long as they remain in particular iterations, meaning if I look at, we have a relatively new iteration of the SAT. It's the digital SAT, and the meta is different than the previous version of the SAT. The previous version of the SAT rewarded mental math and math without a calculator, whereas this version, the new meta is mastering Desmos or some other graphing calculator and really leveraging those tools to an extent that the previous versions of the exam didn't reward. That's one example. Back in the day, I've been in education a very long time. Back in the day, the meta for SAT was stereotypically memorizing 1,000 vocabulary flashcards.
Right.
That skill deprecated over time. Even now, when there is vocabulary to a certain extent on the SAT, it is not, it, flashcards are not necessarily the most effective way to master that vocabulary.
Especially not pre-printed flashcards, or so I've heard on a recent episode of your podcast.
Yeah, well, we're big fans of encouraging people to make their own flashcards. Whether they follow that advice is a whole other thing, right?
Right.
So the meta can change, but not as on the SAT or ACT, it changes almost generationally, meaning that parents who listen to this episode should not imagine that students should be attacking the tests the way that they did, or sometimes even the way their older children did. A new test means a new meta, and you want to look to the experts that have really studied it and kind of learned to carry over the skills that apply and find the right exploits. And, exploit sounds negative, but it's really just to say what strategies and tactics and practices lead to the highest return on invested time.
Mike, thank you so much for being a guest on the Score podcast. I truly appreciate you sharing your incredibly valuable wisdom and insights with us. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I hope you'll join me again soon. Before we wrap up, please let our listeners know the best way to reach out to you and learn more about your work.
Well, first, thank you, Dave. The pleasure really has been mine. Been a thrill to have this conversation with you. You can find me at chariotlearning.com, spelled like chariot. You can find me at gettestbright just testsandtherest.com, or find the Test and the Rest podcast on any podcast syndicator. And you can also look up the TestBright curriculum system. If you're looking for SAT, ACT curriculum, you can subscribe to the free Roots to Words word of the day at roots2words.com. If you're a tutor, you can follow Tutor the newsletter. I mean, you can just find me all over. I'm out there.
In this episode of The Score, Mike Bergin and I discussed the importance of understanding the meta of test prep. That is, the need to adapt your paradigm to suit not only the particular knowledge and skills accentuated by standardized exams like the ACT and SAT, but also the sometimes novel methods these tests employ to measure such knowledge and skills. Mike Bergin has created a host of outstanding resources to help you do just that. And you'll find links to all of those resources in the show notes. But I also strongly encourage you to check out what I think is hands down the very best self-prep system for the digital SAT reading and writing section, and that is the Walker Prep Question Type Inventory. Using the system is easy. Just take an official digital SAT practice test, then go to walkertestprep.com and click on Self-Prep. There, you can look up each question you missed on your official practice test. The inventory will not only tell you the exact question type for each of your misses, it will also provide you with links to the relevant strategy guides and links to targeted practice questions and drills. The Walker Prep self-study system offers the simplest, fastest way to pinpoint your weaknesses and learn powerful strategies for improvement so you can be more confident and score higher on test day. Don't miss this opportunity to achieve your highest potential on digital SAT reading and writing. To start increasing your score today, visit walkertestprep.com and click on Self-Prep. Well, that wraps it up for this week's episode of the Score podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Until then, keep prepping smarter.